Hi, everybody. It's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. It's great to have you with me. Fun to be back in studio after being at the Good Food Conference last week and Plant-Based World the week before that, teaching at Yale, and also been kind of all over the map. 2 interviews at the New York Stock Exchange. So it's been really busy, but I am indeed back home in my studio. Today, I'd like to go slightly off the Plant-Based Business Hour reservation. Usually we're talking about food here. And as you know, on this show, we discuss how if you do not address food and shifting the global food supply system away from unsustainable animal proteins, not only will you not be able to feed a growing population around the world, but you simply won't impact climate change in the time that we need to do it. But if you're making less beef, there's a good chance you're making less leather. So let's take a moment and look at the sustainability challenges and the progress being made therein in the fashion world, the material world, which is why I bring on a dear friend that I met over the summer, the president of the Apparel Impact Institute, Louis Perkins. Louis, thanks for being with me today.
Hey, Elizabeth, thanks for having me.
So happy to have you here. Well, let's dive in. I will say the most of my listeners probably have never heard of the Apparel Impact Institute. Maybe you can give us an overview. What is it, and how did you come to work with AII, as it is known? And what is your fascination with decarbonizing fashion?
Yes, thank you for asking. So, what's interesting about us is that you probably have not heard of us, and yet we were founded by work streams that existed under some of the largest NGOs and corporates. So in 2017, Target, Gap, Inc., and PVH, which is the parent of Tommy Hilfiger, Calvin Klein, and a lot of other wonderful brands that many of us are familiar with, came together and really discussed how are we going to drive environmental and social impacts in our supply chain. We do not own it. And so therefore we source from it, we influence it, and we are the drivers of its positive and negative impact. If we want to change anything about it, then we probably need to do it together, because one of us, as large as we may be, does not have the level of influence nor capital to actually drive a lot of the change needed. They were really interested in a program that had been scaling under the NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council, around energy, water, and chemical efficiency in the dyeing and finishing of clothes, a program called Clean by Design. It had been scaling in China, which is one of the largest production countries and the regions within China for this sector. So they came together and they decided to launch an organization that they could pool their resources and strategies across a common programming for suppliers, bringing solutions, bringing programmatic, initiatives that were successful, and really kind of creating this approach of going at it alone. Quickly, of course, then they wanted to recruit more brands to join them, because if 3 is powerful, what would it look like if we had 10 or 15 or 20 of the largest global brand retailers that are sourcing, these products from these countries? And when you look at the concentration of the supply chain, it clusters in countries and regions where it's most meaningful. Ooh,
I know. I thought I'd bring up some of your partners just to show
I love it. Yeah.
people. Let's see if I've got the good.
You've got some great ones here. And so we're a convener and also an aggregator. What you'll see in front of you is some philanthropies, some industry initiatives like Sustainable Apparel Coalition, some family office private foundations like the Schmidt Family Foundation, a lot of factories, a lot of brands that we work with. And so you can consider us a consortium of about 50 plus brand retailers that represent thousands of factories in their supply chain. We estimate there are well over, 100,000 factories just that we've identified through our overlap. And we know that the ones we cannot reach or do not yet know are out there waiting to do this work. So it's really an industry-wide collaborative. We pool resources from the fashion brands and the retailers that are selling the fashion, and we apply it across the supply chain.
Yeah, so this is key. Those of you who might remember, I had Ian Monroe on the show, as well as Amy Christensen, and we were talking about, which is how we met actually at the Sun Valley Forum. So shout out to Amy Christensen for doing so much to decarbonize industries on this planet. So we met in the summer at the Sun Valley Forum, and Ian was saying in his book about climate change, Ian Monroe, the founder of Etho Capital Consulting Agency, and also teaching at Stanford, 85% of the carbon emissions really come from scope 3. That would be up the supply chain. That's why it's so critical here that the Apparel Impact Institute is using its power, influence, money to really shape that supply chain. Even though you don't own it, you're asking for changes along the supply chain, if I'm understanding you correctly. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And we actually wrote a report with the World Resource Institute for the Science-Based Targets Initiative related to this sector. And we estimate it's well into the mid 95 plus, percent range for this sector. So we're talking about, yes, it's important to put solar panels on your retail and to look at your impact of your corporate, and even shipping and logistics is really important. But when you look at from farm, and this is the supply chain, we're talking about raw material extraction or growth. So we're talking about a lot of farms, a lot of animals in the case of leather, which you mentioned. Then that's being produced into a material that's been processed, a yarn typically, or a leather or some good, that then is going to get turned into a fabric and or some kind of raw material that will be then used, dyed, finished with chemicals and lots of water and a lot of heat and a lot of thermal heat. And then it's going to be cut and sewn into this final product. So that is the network that we're looking at, and it is vast. So when we wrote that report with World Resource Institute, we looked at where is the carbon, particularly because we really are focusing on climate. We know that water, land use, biodiversity, chemical use, all is embedded in that. It is not just carbon emissions. But if we're going to get this industry to reach its science-based targets, and most of the companies that are working with us have committed to SBTs, they're part of the UNFCCC Fashion Charter. And what we're telling them is 50% CO2 emission reduction in the next 6 years by 2030 to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius, with decarbonization by 2040, 2050, right? So most of them are on that trajectory, and that's why they're working with us.
So let me unpack a little bit, again, for my audience who probably isn't that familiar with the fashion industry. I know as I work in food and also some materials through my work with VegTech Invest, it's a little frustrating to say, hey, it is not just energy, and it is not just electric vehicles. It's also building materials. It's also fashion materials, or the fashion supply chain. And it's quite clearly food and the food supply chain. Do you have any trouble getting outside investors? So Target and Gap, they know because they're in it. But do you have outside investors wanting to decarbonize the fashion industry?
We do. One of our lead partners to our Fashion Climate Fund is the Schmidt Family Foundation, which is Wendy and Eric Schmidt, former executive chairman of Google, and his wife. And Wendy has worked with me in a number of capacities over the years, from my time at Cradle to Cradle Institute to launching this initiative, and recognizes the case. But it's a hard case. In fact, I wrote an article about a year and a half ago to the Chronicle of Philanthropy trying to make the case that if you are funding food and ag, if you're interested in land use, if you're interested in lower carbon materials, renewable electricity, thermal heat technologies, you're interested in investing in fashion, right? Yeah. Because that's all these levers that we're looking at: farmers, farmer wellness, regenerative ag, like all of this is the fashion industry. And so it is a challenge. And I think a lot of times we look to industry to clean up their own mess. But there are a number of philanthropists who do get it and understand and are part of this, particularly when you can make those connections. Like, you may not think you fund fashion, but are you interested in funding regenerative ag? And then you can bring in a scope of business that may relate to what their KPIs are at the foundation. The debt and equity piece is not as hard, and that's something that we're working on as well. I mentioned the Fashion Climate Fund, which is a $250 million fund, which is catalytic capital, grant making. It's a donor pooled fund that we've raised, and then it's intended to unlock another 1.75 in debt and equity. We find that with investors from debt and equity, it's not a matter of will they, it's a matter of helping find the good projects, right? And so demonstrating what good investment should look like in this sector to meet, yes, return on investment performance, but what we're interested in is return on carbon emissions reduction performance, water savings, so as we're looking at these other metrics that are critical for ESG investment, that's how we're making that case. And I think it's easy for most of particularly the banks, to understand, because they're already doing a lot of this work in farms and in industrial parks and settings where the making of things is happening. It's now just centering them in on how this sector is one more way your finance deployment is going to help you achieve your goals for sustainable finance.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack there. I was going to write some notes down. Let's see if I remember it all. So I would make the opposite argument as well. If you are investing in cleaning up the fashion supply chain, then you are probably also interested in cleaning up the food supply chain. And they do overlap quite a bit. Certainly with food, agriculture being about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions, with animal agriculture being 32% of the world's global methane emissions. Methane being one of the more nefarious of the gases and being very potent in a shorter part of time, which is a good thing, because you can also, through emissions avoidance, bring down methane and then have positive effects in a shorter amount of time. So simply, you will not impact climate change in the time that we need to do it if you're not looking at that methane number. One need only think of a tannery. And I was in Colombia waiting at a bus stop next to a tannery. A tannery is where they take leather and they douse it in chemicals to, I guess, soften it up. I'm not even sure why, but probably to soften it up. And I just couldn't keep myself from throwing up. It was so potent. You couldn't even be a block away waiting for the bus without being sick. So, then that just goes into land. So just to give people a visual of what we're talking about when we're talking about processing these materials. Okay, so you have the companies themselves, Tommy Hilfiger, Gap, Target. And then you also have philanthropists, and then you've started a fund, 250 million from donors. How are you measuring? Because getting the exact numbers to know that you're making progress, how are you measuring? And also, maybe this is going to seem elementary for you, but again, for my listeners, I think it's a little bit of a disconnect for people to understand. I'm investing in something to have less impact. How does that work, that you invest for more projects, but at the end you come up with less of a footprint? Maybe just help people understand that.
Yeah, great question. So in this case, there's a couple of elephants in the room around the fashion industry, and I'd be remiss in not saying, one of them is overproduction and overconsumption. And so cleaning up the supply chain also does involve looking at the model that we currently have. And some of that is also around better inventory management, better sourcing, better practices related to how many seasons we're putting out, how we better connect sizing to individuals so we don't have returns. So there's a whole bunch of work that's happening on, can we shift consumers to want to have a deeper and better relationship to the apparel on the back end? But then there's this other piece, which is, regardless, this is a growing industry. There are growing citizens on planet Earth. Right. There are more people with purchasing power to consume. So you kind of have to do both, right? You have to fix the model of production of consumption, and overproduction. But you also have to look at, when we are making it, how are we making it? And are we doing it with a carbon neutral, net zero, negative impact kind of approach? So I think that's the big part, of like what we're doing is really trying to address that. And the way that we measure our performance is that we have a direct relationship to the supplier that we're providing grant subsidy to. So our fund that I mentioned is made up of 6 lead partners to the fund and many additional contributors to the funding model ecosystem. So what that means for us is that a brand retailer who's putting in the lead partnership has a certain role, and a lot of that is philanthropic, to identify the projects and then give subsidy and support to those projects and those programs and innovations to get from pilot to scale phase. But we also provide resources to the factory to take it on, to do carbon baselining, to do, to benchmark their current carbon emissions, to create a plan and a strategy for how they're going to reduce that, and then to also implement an efficiency program, the Clean by Design program. So because we're in there with third-party partners actually in the factory, the facility, and next phase of the farm, we're building that relationship where we're measuring day 1, day 80, 90, day 180, so that we're looking out over a course of time where we're actually capturing the reduction of negative impact. And then that's coming into our organization. We're actually building out a platform that's called the Climate Solutions Portfolio Platform that matches to the grant making and the brand recruitment and the industry recruitment side, so that I could as a user, I would be able to log in as a brand and see the 37 factories that I'm working with and sourcing from who are leveraging AII's fund, running programs through AII, and I could look at what was the carbon 6 months ago versus where is it today and where is it projected to be based on the levers that we're pulling by implementing these technologies and solutions. So that's how we're going to measure the data. And what's important for the investors from the industry side who are putting money into this, at the end of the day, they want credit. They want to know that I put in X amount, I subsidize the cost of this facility or farm to take on these improvements. AII also brought debt and equity to the table to help the facility incentivize them with cheaper, more sustainable finance. But at the end of the day, if I'm 5% of the volume of production of that industrial park, am I getting credit for 5% of the CO2 emission reduction that I can then state to my science-based targets commitment? And the answer is yes. So that's the system that we're also building out.
Again, so much to unpack. This time I did write down notes, so I think I'll be able to hit it all. One thing that I see that is so impressive about AII is that you got buy-in early from the people, from the entities that are making the emissions. Yeah. So there's no industry fighting you, right? There's not like a fashion industry that's spending millions of dollars on a negative campaign saying that fashion has no footprint.
That's right. That's right.
That's amazing.
The industry agrees. I mean, you don't see that. That's no longer debatable. And I think the industry agrees and is getting very transparent about how clothes are being made. And most of them are publicly stating, this is what we're doing about it. This is how we're going about it. And that is encouraging, because we don't have anyone fighting us other than the system itself, which is built to not incentivize the change. So the system has to change, and then recognizing the role we can play to get every player within this ecosystem of change moving forward in the role that they can play, right?
But you have so many big players already. Yeah. You almost have critical mass at tipping point. So if you're not a part of AII, you're doing something wrong. Well, it's like I don't want to shame anyone, but it has a little bit of that, like, bad egg if you aren't getting on the boat. So I think that's really incredible. So call out to the meat industry, JBS, Tyson, Purdue, Maple Leaf, the rest of them, to stop fighting the global food systems transformation and get on board and start pouring in the dollars and working on the supply chain and getting credit for it, and looking at those sustainability numbers and stop ignoring climate change, et cetera. So I love what you're doing. Let me ask you some tactical questions. So is there any program, and this might be elementary, maybe too small to be considered impactful, but I'm not sure. Levi's has a program where you turn in your old jeans, which Levi's being exceptional in there, like, the Levi's from the 70s are the coolest. Yeah. So is there any sort of global push to have a vintage swap program as we talk about consuming less and making less?
Yeah, absolutely. And while that's not necessarily directly the work that AII is doing, it's work that I'm very close to, because prior to this, I ran the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute, which was very much focused on creating circular economies and shared economies. Right. So in that model, as you said, like, this shirt is better being a shirt forever. But there's going to be a day when it's just threadbare and it's been loved and it's been worn. No matter how many people you pass it to, it's just going to no longer be a shirt. And at that moment, do we have a system in place to ensure that the fibers are 100% biodegradable in this case, because this is linen that I'm wearing after Labor Day. And we want to make sure that there's no toxic chemicals or dyes or anything that's going to be harmful for water tables and for, this to be properly collected and properly put into a system. You can also upcycle this linen material into a rayon-like fabric. It's a cellulose, and I could apply a certain chemistry to it to turn it into a rayon-like next generation fabric. So after it's been the linen shirt, it could be converted into a next generation material from man-made cellulosics that then becomes this other great fabric. So there's all kinds of interventions and technology and solutions on that side. And you were also asking me about this sort of what I call the shared economy, which sits right next to the circular economy, which is also addressing the global equation of production and consumption, which is if we have a relationship and we value things because they're vintage, because they're unique, they're one of a kind, you can't get them, somebody else interesting owned them, whatever it is. Or I took it and I refashioned it and added a collar from another shirt, and now it has more personality, and put a patch on it. Like, I do that a lot with stuff that I have that is, falling apart, or or a moth got to it, but it was an expensive suit. Find a creative way to give it an additional life. And that is growing, and that's happening all over the planet. And there are Global Fashion Exchange is one that's working, that does swaps around the world for people bringing in vintage and really cool pieces of clothing to, excuse me, I'm talking so fast and getting excited, I'm coughing. I'm going to take a sip.
Take a sip.
But yes, it's happening. And I think that's exciting too. And I like that you brought up the example about Levi's, because I think there's a real, where we are right now is that, and this is not just fashion, this is everywhere, we don't really have a extended producer responsibility ethos in corporate in a way that we should, which means if I'm the producer of a product and I have sourced those materials, I'm contributing to them being grown, extruded, extracted, all these things that I'm contributing to, then once it becomes my material and my product, I have a relationship to where it goes. And what's interesting about it is if I track that molecule, that material, that fiber, that button through its life, I can also maintain a relationship to the consumer. And I can tell stories about it, and I can engage them with my brand. So I loved seeing that companies like Levi's are actually saying, we're not just going to let Levi's jeans be valuable at vintage shops out there. We're going to have a relationship to that. And we want to be a part of this shared economy because we also, A, believe in it, but B, know that's a great way to keep citizens engaged with our brand.
Yeah, and you keep them back in the store because they're coming back into the store to, and it says how proud you are of your jeans. You don't want to let them go. I mean, I just think it's really great. But you brought up something here that I want to dive into a little bit. I know with food, so there's a lot of food waste, and that creates a lot of carbon. And here you're talking about upcycling materials, which I love. But at least in the food industry, basically animal ag, puts out a lot of external damage that they don't have to pay for. So it's not just that they're using a lot of land and water, it's that they're polluting water systems, where do 80 billion and factory animals go to the bathroom? Well, they don't have indoor plumbing. It's your land and water. So this costs such as that. Is it the same in the fashion industry, where the fashion industry doesn't have to pay for the costs they externalize?
Yeah, it is true. And it's true that there's no direct measurement or correlation to the externalities, environmental or social, that I think are they're happening. And they're happening in countries that, oftentimes not where we are. And so we don't see it. We don't know it in the same way that if that facility was in our town, we might be more aware. But there's been some really interesting initiatives that have been out there that have drawn attention to the impact of facilities. There's one that colleague of ours, Dr. Linda Greer, who was at the NRDC, was working with called IPE, that has focused in China on measuring air quality and water quality around industrial parks. And then citizens can get involved. And this is obviously the Chinese government has blessed this, sort of sanctioned this, but you can text a picture of it to the tool and it can say, hey, on this day, this water outside in this, little pond outside this industrial park didn't look so great, or the air quality didn't smell a certain way. And because they have metering and monitors, they can match that information up, and they can roll that up in a way that can say, hey, ultimately a brand retailer could find out that industrial park is in sort of an alert zone based on these self-reported or reported local citizen kind of identification. So I think the more and more there's accountability to the externalities it's getting back up to corporate and ultimately citizens. Because if we know, then we might care. But when it's so far away in another part of the world, we don't know if there's forced labor. We don't know if there's pollution of the water systems with dyes. There used to be this adage that would go around. You can probably find it as a meme on social media, that if you want to know the next season's collection fashion colors, just look at the rivers of China. And I think that was something that, because it got so widely distributed and showed up in PowerPoint decks at environmental conferences, and everybody's presentation had these stories, whether it was true or not, it obviously had an impact, because it got back to the country, it got back to the companies, and people said, hey, we need to do something about water quality and also water filtration and wastewater treatment. And we need to own a relationship to that, because the last thing that I want, if I'm one of these fashion brands, is somebody standing outside my runway fashion show where all the media is showing up to see the new collection and showing pictures of purple dyed lakes or rivers or streams outside the factories that are dyeing that purple on the runway this week.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a little bit of a fantastic story, but I think that's exactly what we don't want from the side of protecting a brand's goodwill. And so therefore there's much more incentive, I think, now, because there's more through social media and through storytelling globally. There's a lot more information around the transparency of these supply chains and what's really happening or could be happening, both social and environmental.
I couldn't agree more. We are entering into a more and more transparent supply chain society, and a more educated consumer and a more angry consumer willing to really take companies to task. And I know the meat industry has the same thing. It has labor issues. Lots of miners work in slaughterhouses. Lots of undocumented workers live in slaughterhouses. No health care usually. And so sick employees, something we saw during COVID, for example. And then 13 states have it that it's illegal to take any pictures in a slaughterhouse. So there's an intentionality, which is why that industry can continue to hide. Whereas you see the fashion industry embracing and coming to the light and owning it, whereas the meat industry is still digging in their heels because they can hide behind laws that allow them to not be transparent to the consumer. I ultimately believe this will come to bite them. I started my career after business school at the Kellogg Company. So I was running Special K and Frosted Mini Wheats. And we used to always say, because the government would change nutritional labels and laws and what you had to put on a nutritional label and how you had to measure nutrition. And so you might find that a measuring law had changed, and Special K was going to go from 0.4 fat, which would keep it under 0.5, which would mean it could be 0 fat, to 0.6 fat. You'd have to round up, and it would be 1 gram of fat on the label, which would make you no longer a fat-free brand. And that's the end of your brand. Kellogg's Special K can't have fat. So we would always say, let's get out ahead and own this. We want to being first has equity. So I think there's a real, beyond goodwill and branding, there's a real tangible financial benefit to getting out and owning this stuff before somebody has a really bad labor story on you and it goes viral. So hats off to the fashion community for getting behind this. If you'd like to jump in, you can. Otherwise, I'm going to ask another question. Okay, I'll keep going with my questions here that I did put down. So what kind of projects are you funding with the Fashion Climate Fund? Is it startups, or are you giving money to the bigger players for new technologies?
It's generally our vision is not startup. So this sector has done a lot of piloting. There's been a lot of piloting of technologies like waterless dyeing or dry processing, things that might not use thermal heat. Thus, they might not burn coal or natural gas or biomass, so lower carbon. There are things that have been piloted around next generation materials that are made from, agricultural waste, which is a great link into this sector as well. Or, or other types of, I mentioned the man-made cellulosics. It can be made from sort of any cellulose-based material, but they're not scaling. And so one of the reasons that they're not scaling is because there really hasn't been global agreement on the direction of what's good and what's successful and what's measured. And then how do we get that beyond just one company testing it out to scalability? And you've got these long-term partnerships and relationships with certain types of raw materials. And this is what the designers know, and this is what the factories know. And so it's like anything. And I used to work a lot in the built environment with buildings. And when I was in that space, it was like educating the carpet installer on why they needed to change the adhesive for the carpet tile in order to keep the carpet tile 100% recyclable nylon back into the system. But if they used other kind of adhesive, then the whole thing had to go to landfill. And so we're in that phase of like, how do we now get something that's workable and doable and good into scale phase? So our goal is that we, in an ideal world, there's enough really good pilots with proven data that we want to get to scale phase, that AII just comes in to move it from pilot to scale.
Great.
Now there's going to be some modeling it out, like maybe it worked in nylon, but we don't know if it works with cotton, or maybe it worked with, apparel, but could we also apply this technology to footwear? So we would also play in that space too, to say, hey, it's been piloted in one product category, in one region, in one manufacturing process, but now we think we can take that same thermal heat technology or same material technology and apply it in another way. That's where we think we ideally should be playing. That being said, there are some things that are early stage that just still need our support. And if they're at a place where we want to ensure that this gets to scale phase, we may take them on. So in the first call for proposals, we have 10 awardees, and each one of them, I'm pretty sure all of them are getting a multi-year grant. Maybe one of them is getting a 1 year. But our intent is also that once we identify you, we think you are a long-term proven solution to get to scale as part of the solution for total decarbonization, net zero. So we want you in our portfolio. I'm putting little quotes around it because it is a portfolio of investments, but it's also our own fund portfolio. And it's also the way that a manufacturer or brand could log on and see what's working and potentially recruit a facility to adopt it and look for subsidy to help it. So if that's our intent, then populating that with more than just 5 projects at a time is going to be critical. But the first ones are pretty big, heavy hitters. And most of them are focusing on scaling greater levels of efficiency work in new regions that we maybe haven't been in or that we want to go deeper in, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. High volume, high concentration of production. We need to get more efficiency programs out there because they're the step one. They return investment back to the manufacturer by saving water bills, energy bills. So it's kind of a win-win. If you can't do this, you're probably not going to do the big capital expenditure investments that are coming when you have to replace equipment. But the one that you mentioned, or the one that I want to mention that does fit in the startup phase or pilot phase for us, is a technology that is looking at using lower levels of fertilizer in farms, primarily related to cotton production. And one of the big drivers, so when we put this report out that I referenced earlier about where's the carbon, and we identified that in raw materials, it's 25% of the CO2 emissions are in the farm or raw material phase. And then as you get through the different phases of development, they have different amounts. By the way, wet processing, dyeing, and finishing of fabric is over 50% of the carbon emissions, mainly because we're using on-site coal or natural gas or burning something to get those temperatures hot enough. And so that's a big area for disruption. But if we go back to this grantee that we're excited about, they are using a technology where a farmer can actually apply this learning system around matching colors of leaves to amount of fertilizer that you use. And it's something that's been proven to lower fertilizer and still get the yield that you're looking for in your production. In the farming of cotton. And so we want to test this out more. We want to pilot more. We want to be able to really see, is this really a workable scalability? Because the percentages of fertilizer reduction, which would equate to CO2 reduction that we can claim as a result, would be huge if this is something to scale across all cotton farms globally. So that's kind of what we're looking for, is likelihood to be a big global scalable winner. And then we'll invest in it early, again, with grant making dollars. But the bigger thing that I think we bring besides the $250 million to the plate, and by the way, our award prices are between $25,000 and up to 500,000. So they're not huge, but they bring you into our portfolio. And now you have visibility of all the global brands, retailers, and eventually suppliers who may want to take on this technology. And our role will be to help incentivize those farms and factories to implement all these technologies through subsidy, through longer term brand relationships for sourcing, any of the levers that we can strengthen to make that possible.
Yeah, you're so far along. It's really impressive to see how everyone's working together and you're able to throw money at big, scalable solutions. We have something called Material Innovation Initiative headed up by Nicole Rowling. You maybe know her. And if you don't, I will make an introduction. I think we've talked about it before, but you see them also working on non-animal alternatives for carbon reduction. I just want to take a moment here and everybody get your glasses on, scoot in, get close to your screen so you can see some of the material benefits from programs in 2021 of the Apparel Impact Institute. I'm looking here at 10%, so 316,451 tons of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. 2,903,575 cubic water, less cubic meters of water. So 10% reduction basically in greenhouse gas emissions, 10% reduction in water usage. Capital invested was only 28 million. That seems strange to me.
Yeah, so this is the capital that has been invested through AII programming before we unlock blended capital. So think of that as the funding that we've also brought to the table to be able to implement that. Now we have a strategy where, so we've been able to also track what level of debt financing potentially has gone into a lot of these programs and initiatives. And, we estimate that if we continue to deploy our funds, we can unlock, as I mentioned earlier, about 1.75 billion in debt and equity, with 1.2 of that coming from sustainable debt financing and 400 million coming from venture capital or impact investing. So our goal now is to actually not let it be passive, but to build those relationships with development banks, commercial banks, institutional investors, family offices and foundations who are also using different asset classes to have a continuum of leveraging resources from grant making to debt to equity subsidy. And so that is our strategy moving forward. So the next time you look at the results from that on our website, you'll start to see even more blended capital unlock in addition to what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah, it's just really amazing. And you've only been around 5-6 years. I mean,
five years, really.
It makes all the difference in the world when you don't have someone fighting you. When you have the big industry players with big, deep pockets who, like we said at Kellogg, want the equity of leading by example. And there's a lot of equity in that. Let me just say it's Apparel Impact Institute. So you can see that website at the bottom of your screen, everybody, apparelimpact.org. But materials would also go to furniture. Is furniture included in what you do?
It's not currently, and I'll tell you, we do a lot of home bedding and home interiors, and I can see a future where, because there's just so much overlap with the materials that we're using, that we would expand beyond, and particularly because we have partners like Target and H&M Home, that are producing, home goods. I think there's a future where we can do that. And like I said, we already do a lot of home bedding because it's the same textile mills that we're also producing for apparel, or they're in the same regions. And if you're going to go in and pick 25 mills for textile apparel and there's 15 there that are doing home bedding, then why wouldn't you also include them? And so I think that's a big part of our growing strategy is, at what point would we want to ensure that we're looking at those regions and industrial parks in a holistic way, which also means collaborating with other sectors making products like electronics and other durables and hard goods that are going to be right in those industrial parks. Because a lot of the levers that you pull, and particularly from an investment perspective, don't need to be building by building. They need to be at the meta. And so as we start to really look at, hey, we've got 50 manufacturing by 4 different sectors, can we bring those other sectors into the room and look at what deployment of directing them towards decarbonization solutions and strategies at the industrial park level and bringing that finance. So I think that's also in our future as we move beyond just focusing on these apparel producers.
Well, it's more than apparent, obviously, the environmental sustainability, even labor advantages to all this, because toxic chemicals are,
Absolutely.
toxic. And from there, one can see the financial benefit if you're using less water, using less land. And at some point, we will have, I believe, carbon taxes and other kind. I don't think industries such as fashion and meat will be able to externalize forever. So these are risks of increased costs in the future. So you can see the financial benefit as well. That said, maybe, and this is a question, I'm not sure, maybe some sectors are more interested in playing a role than others. So do you see any hesitation from the animal materials? So that would be leather, but that would also be down, that would be wool, that would be cashmere, that would be silk. Many people probably think that leather is the most impactful on the climate, but it's actually silk. Do I have that right? And please get rid of down. I'm begging you to please.
It would depend on which what you're looking through the lens of. If you're looking at the lens of water, carbon, land use, so
carbon,
I think so I think that in many ways, petroleum based materials, which by the way is 65 to 70% of what's in our clothes. What we're wearing globally is about 65 to 70% petroleum based. So that's obviously going to have a huge,
Sure.
CO2 emission footprint. And then cotton, is high too, mainly in the use of water, as we mentioned. But if you're looking at carbon emissions, we mentioned fertilizer. So they all have a slightly different one. There is an incentive for us to try to not. So while I talk about next generation materials, the easiest thing to do is also improve the existing materials. So then you're not having to change, as I mentioned, sourcing practices, sourcing partnerships, materials that the designers can use. You're actually saying, let's make lower carbon emitting leather, cotton, wool, et cetera. And so I think that's a big part of the work that we want to do in partnership with an organization we work with called the Textile Exchange. But it doesn't mean there's not room to shift the matrix of materials to some of these next generation materials. Leather alternatives coming from not from cows is a big opportunity as well too, as we start to look at that.
Well, so when you look at the real meta, so not just the manufacturing park, but the real meta being the globe, you see that you can save carbon by upcycling what Dole already does. Pineapple skins, so you alleviate emissions avoidance of food waste. Upcycle pineapple skins to create alternative leather that doesn't need a tannery and isn't from cows. And you've got a double whammy there. So when you're looking cross industry as well as just cross production in a manufacturing park, you see the creativity that can unlock many solutions. So I love to see that, and I love what Dole's doing. They're not the only ones who are upcycling for alternative leathers, but I am deeply interested in alternative downs and alternative feathers and anything like this. And I remember going to buy a couch, and I said, I don't want any feathers, any down. And they didn't even know themselves, like what had that and what didn't. So I think there's still room for education all around. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, if you talk to the people inside corporate that are on the design teams, obviously they would be deeply intimate with all of that. But if you're talking to the sales reps that are out there about the products, they're trying to, that's absolutely right. It's interesting when we would put cradle to cradle certification on products. When I was running the institute, I would go to stores and just act like I was a uninformed citizen and ask about this thing and what does this mean? And, it's just getting that information trickling down so the citizen / consumer can really understand, is always a boundary. In the same way as I mentioned the story of the carpet installers who still use, it's 100% sustainable, recyclable nylon carpet that is now being applied with toxic chemicals. That means it's going to go to landfill. So it's like this disconnect so that we can actually pull the driver through. And I think that's really big too. And, I do on the next generation materials piece, I think, what's going to also drive a lot of that is that it's going to be increasingly challenging to grow, cultivate, and provide a lot of the crops and animals globally under the heating up of our planet and the lack of resources, land, water. So I think that's something that as you look at an immediate fix to lower the carbon of your current products, but I love the investment that's happening in the development of a longer term materials alternative future, because we're going to want to pull the trigger on scaling things as soon as we realize that global drought is contributing to the lack of the ability, and the pricing of some of these raw materials will go so high that we're going to have to look to that. And that's just inevitable.
That's math.
Yeah, it's math. But, right now, a lot of those next generation materials are stuck in their pilot phase. And I'm not working as closely on that front right now, but I'm very interested in, what will get more of those materials to scale phase, and because, you hear so often, and I'm sure this is true in food and ag too, it's like, it's not scalable. And you go, well, isn't everything technically scalable if you use capitalism and you show that people can make money on it, and it fits in the valuation of the product and and the pricing? And it's like, everything is scalable if it works, then it can be scalable. And I think that's the challenge right now, is to understand, does it work? Does it achieve the good? Are there other externalities we create? I mean, in the processing of some of these alternative materials, we're using chemistry. Is all that chemistry good? How much water are we using? Are the chemicals getting back into this? So it's the same thing. So we just have to be careful that by solving for one thing, we aren't creating 4 other things, right?
Yes, 100%.
And a lot of those next gen materials have not yet been proven how they can be recycled. So they have one life. So that's just something that we have to, think about, as we also say, okay, now we have a secondary initiative, which is to find those next generation materials that can be in continuous material loops through circular economies, right? So
well, we are just at the beginning phase of the innovation cycle. So we have a long, we're just starting 100%. This S curve. But I would say that, again, as we look at the meta that is planet Earth, it's really interesting to see next gen materials come online. And a lot of it's just from upcycling of food waste. But you see probably a company you're already working with, companies like Crocs, which are saying not only will we not have inefficient animal leather, but we are dedicated to bio materials to replace petrol materials. So less dependency on the fossil fuel plastics and more bio-based solutions. You see, I don't know if you're working with makeup, doesn't sound like you are yet, those kind of home care things, but you see companies like Elf, Eyes, Lips, and Face is what it stands for, Elf, replacing animal products in all of their beauty care because they want that better sustainability. So now you're back to better financial returns and sustainability footprints. So we see, because in VegTech Invest, we invest in alternative materials as well as food. We see that alternative materials act as kind of a hedge, for lack of a better expression, to the food industry, because they don't move up and down at the same way. So you're diversified in that investment by doing alternative materials for the planet as well as food. So there's a lot of room for alternative materials. It's a very, very exciting arena. Okay, so as we wrap up here, some quickie questions. This is kind of an anecdotal thing, but do you see anyone in the fashion industry saying, hey, with climate change, we're going to need less down, or we're going to need less wool, or we're going to need less winter clothes, or that's just really not on anyone's radar yet? I have not heard that. That's very interesting. And I also think, what climate change and temperature increase also has, there's these weird swings of extreme colds and extremes. So I think that, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I have not heard in sort of the betting on the futures of the materials we will need versus the ones we won't. Good point. Okay, we'll have to see how it all shakes out. Hopefully we'll still be here. One never really knows. Okay, so what does the fashion industry really need to do? What's the thing that's not working? What's your one big challenge that you're facing now? Well, I think, it was interesting because I love that you said, you don't have anybody that's sort of up against you and trying to, attack the work that you're doing, and what a blessing for that. But I think what is against us is that we have a system in place we need to figure out around how to
incentivize farmers and factories, and we're talking about like oftentimes small medium enterprises. These are not like a lot of the high volume producers are huge multinational companies that are also producing a lot of these, but there's also many family owned businesses out there who want to do the right thing and take this on, but they're not necessarily incentivized with better pricing, with more long-term partnership agreements to be able to say, this brand retailer is going to source from me in 5 years or 10 years, and the life of my loan to take on all these environmental performance improvements might be that long. And so how do we kind of create a system change where we de-risk investment and also point it toward the right solutions at the same time, right? And so I think that's the big thing that I think needs to happen. And I think we need to take a little bit more of an honest look at ourselves, all of us across this value chain and the roles we all play, to say, how long can we carry the current system in a way that we can't make some pivots that are about longer term relationship building, longer term investment strategies to ensure that we're incentivizing, economic development and resilience in these countries that, by the way, are some of the most vulnerable to climate change, are the same ones making our clothes. So it's a holistic investment in those regions and countries to support them and to support all the businesses, big and small, that are making up that really big economy in these countries.
Yeah, it's a question of carrot and stick and getting the major players, and that would include banks, everyone in the business supply chain, understanding that, you can have job growth, you can have real wealth creation. Think of going from the horse and buggy to the car, from the landline to the cell phone. You're talking these seismic shifts of an entire industry like fashion and food creates enormous amounts of wealth. Not to mention jobs. You can have that, or you can have huge fines for dumping. Your choice. People can talk about you on social media as being an awful slave labor employer, or you can get credit for carbon offsets. Your choice. How do you want to go?
And that's why so I mentioned the report we wrote with World Resource Institute on the carbon roadmap to net zero for the fashion sector. Then we took that data and wrote a second report on investment called Unlocking the $1 trillion opportunity to decarbonize fashion. And we didn't title it the cost, the $1 trillion tab. We titled it opportunity, because within that trillion is a lot of wealth creation. There's a lot of investment that will yield benefit to, those that put in the investment dollars. And that's across all kinds of asset classes of investment. So I think it's a really exciting time for innovation as well.
Oh my gosh, so exciting. As we wrap up here, I want to thank everybody on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter for being with me and Louis today. Louis, I have an exit question for you. So before we leave, what do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now? You can change that, 8, 5, 12.
Yeah. What do I wish I knew 10 years ago that I know now? That's a great one. And I think, in the context of like this work, it's that we're all going to get rewarded for being bold. And I'll tell you, I played it safer earlier on in my career. And I think I'm at a place now where, for better or worse, I'm a little bit more bold about what I'm asking for and what I'm saying. Even this interview, there's been a couple of things that, maybe like, oh, well, we can't touch that, or, oh, we can't say that. And I'm very corporate friendly, and so I want to see businesses thrive and survive. But I think that if I had known 10 years ago that not only was it safe to tell the truth on, to call out, but also you will be rewarded if you do. And everything you're working for and everything you believed in will be rewarded by you being bold, honest, and truthful. And then your actions can follow that. And if they do, I think that's what I wish this Louis would tell that guy. And I just would have gotten started faster. And it's not, I landed here and I've been building it and being pretty honest for the last decade. But I think the more and more, and what I mean by honesty is just be bold and tell, like, this is the handwriting on the wall. This is the elephant in the room. This is the systems change we need. Let's all get real. It's not personal. It just has to happen. So let's just do it,
I love it. There's actually a lot more work trying to cover up that which is happening than facing it and just fixing it. So
Yeah.
I love what you say. We will all be rewarded for being bold. Everybody take that with you today. Huge shout out to Amy Christensen, because she does put on the Sun Valley Forum, and she is how we met. I want to thank everybody on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. We are going to end our show now. Lewis Perkins, you don't go away. You are so super fabulous. I'm going to tap into that great brain of yours about writing a report about unlocking the $1 trillion plus potential. Maybe the alternative foods industry can do that. So you stay put, don't go away. Everybody else, gosh, I love you. Thanks for doing everything you do. You shall be rewarded for being bold. So keep at it, people. And I will see you all